Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first public event of this new academic year, part of the series of lectures called All This Rising, the Humanities in the Next 10 Years. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that real-time captioning is available for today's event. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom where it says CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow next to the CC icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. The mission of this lecture series, which began in 2020, is to deliver attention to ideas and methods that will mark new paths for the humanities in the next 10 years. The name of the series comes from a poem by Fred Moten in his book, All That Beauty. All this heroic rising above not hearing, and this rising in absolute north against the grain. When I became director of the center 2 years ago, one of my priorities was to reinforce our distinctive office at Stanford as a research institute with public-facing programs. The SHC is unusual among university-based humanities centers in that we both house a large number of fellows working on their own projects. This year, we will have more than 50 under our roof, and we put on events for the Stanford community. When we do it right, these two sides of our agenda enrich each other. The fellows find their work enlivened by the visiting speakers, and the visitors encounter an audience that includes not only Stanford scholars and students, but many others who have met for the year at this intellectual crossroads. Now, since the pandemic began, you who join us online are part of that audience too. Some of you are our former fellows who now for the first time are able to reconnect with our center intellectually. Others are Stanford alumni or simply thinking people who have discovered us. Whoever you may be, you're all welcome here, and we intend to keep providing you with events that will enlarge your horizons even when the pandemic is over. In the past 2 years, we've launched several series and initiatives, of which All This Rising is one. Please watch our website, shc.stanford.edu, for forthcoming events. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And if you would like to submit a question to the speaker, of course, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to it following the lecture. Our guest, the philosopher Kate Manne of Cornell University, will speak on what is gaslighting. In Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, the book published only 3 years ago that brought Kate Manne to wide attention, there's a moment in the introduction in which she confronts two strands in her work. She writes that, quote, "In much of our thinking and acting, we channel and enact social forces far beyond our threshold of conscious awareness or even ability to recover, and sometimes markedly contrary to our explicit moral beliefs and political commitments. There is hence a risk of convincing ourselves on the basis of post hoc reasoning not to look too hard at the residual patriarchal forces operating in our culture. There is also a risk," she goes on, "of exempting individual agents from blame or responsibility for misogynistic behavior," unquote. Much of Professor Manne's writing in that first book, and then in her second, entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, which appeared last year, has been devoted to resisting these conditions, moving the threshold of conscious awareness, looking hard at the relics of patriarchy in our culture, and thinking unflinchingly about how individuals are complicit in sexism. Review essays and commentary about Down Girl have appeared in The New Yorker, The Washington Post, the Times Literary Supplement, and the LA Review of Books, among many other venues. Professor Manne also regularly writes opinion pieces, essays, and reviews on moral and political topics in venues including the New York Times, the Boston Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the TLS again, among others. A graduate of the University of Melbourne and MIT, she's a former junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and has taught at the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell since 2013. We at the Stanford Humanities Center are honored to welcome her as the first speaker of what we know will be an intellectually rich year. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Professor Green. And let me just say how grateful I am to be here. It was such an honor to receive this invitation. And I also want to thank all of the good people at the Stanford Humanities Center who have done so much organizational labor to make this event possible and to accommodate me in doing this event online. So I really am tremendously grateful for this chance to speak to you all. So I'll just share my screen now. And I thought I would just begin by giving a sense of why I'm so interested in this question of what gaslighting is. A couple of reasons are the intrinsic interest of the phenomenon. So gaslighting, I take it, is an inherently rather puzzling phenomenon where, very roughly speaking, agents are prevailed upon not to believe the evidence of their senses or their own memories, their own experiences by epistemically dominant agents. And it's puzzling how that can occur. So that's one reason I'm interested in the topic. Another reason is that, as Professor Green mentioned in his wonderful introduction that I'm so grateful for, I've been interested in the subject of misogyny for about the last, I suppose now, 7 years. And I think gaslighting works to conceal and perpetuate a great deal of misogyny in ways that I hope will come out during this talk. Interestingly, as well as that, we'll also see ways in which misogyny can be a tool of gaslighting. And the final reason is that gaslighting is a word that is being used much more frequently in recent years. So it was actually 2018. In 2018, it was the OED's buzzword of the year. So my feeling is that when a word proliferates in culture, that's often an opportunity for philosophers in particular and humanists in general to look at the phenomenon referred to by the term and try to work out what it is and why it matters and why it might matter at this particular cultural moment. So that's enough by way of preamble. Okay, so I'll start with some extant definitions of gaslighting, which I will seek to problematize as the talk continues. So I'll begin with the psychiatrist Neil Klein's definition, and this is from an autobiographical piece of his in 2006. He defines gaslighting as the effort of one person to undermine another person's confidence and stability by causing the victim to doubt their own senses and beliefs. Okay, so far so standard. Similarly, the good old OED, I have to include a dictionary definition for the sake of posterity, says that gaslighting is the action or process of manipulating a person by psychological means into questioning his or her own sanity. Again, another similar definition is offered by the philosopher Veronica Ivy, who was then writing as Rachel McKinnon. She writes that when a hearer tells a speaker that the speaker's claim isn't that serious, or they're overreacting, or they're being too sensitive, or they're not interpreting events properly, then that constitutes gaslighting. And finally, the psychologist Paige Sweet, whose empirical work on gaslighting I'll draw on later in this talk, defines gaslighting as a type of psychological abuse aimed at making victims seem or feel crazy, creating a surreal interpersonal environment, which, as a substantive matter of fact, often relies on the association of femininity with irrationality. So I take it these definitions all have something important in common, which is that they assume that gaslighting works by undermining a victim's rational capacities or making her question her own sanity or rationality more broadly. And I'm going to be arguing that, in point of fact, gaslighting can also work by making someone question her moral rectitude or the goodness of her own character. And that this is actually a prevalent and important form of gaslighting that makes gaslighting a more everyday phenomenon than we may have hitherto appreciated. But before I get there, I also want to pause over the philosopher Kate Abramson's characterization of gaslighting in her very insightful and important 2014 piece, Turning Up the Lights on Gaslighting. So I should say that Abramson's project, like the previous authors, is different than mine. None of these authors are particularly focused on defining and characterizing gaslighting. They're focused on other features of it, but they nevertheless have to take a stand on what gaslighting is in the course of, in Abramson's case, having an account of the moral wrongness of gaslighting. So her project of accounting for what's morally so wrongful about gaslighting and so harmful about this practice sees her taking a stand on exactly what gaslighting is, that I want to question in what follows. So she says that very roughly the phenomenon that's come to be picked out with that term, gaslighting, is a form of emotional manipulation in which the victim tries, consciously or not, to induce in someone the sense that her reactions, perceptions, and or beliefs, as well as memories, are not just mistaken, but utterly without grounds, paradigmatically so unfounded as to qualify as crazy. And I should add an addendum that the word crazy is, of course, a deeply ableist term. When it's being used in this literature, it's being used in scare quotes to indicate that this is the ableist perception that the gaslighter is trying to take advantage of in making his victim feel quote unquote crazy. This isn't to endorse that label for the properties that he attempts to portray his victim as having, or that he holds his victim does in fact have. So because of Abramson's view about what gaslighting is, she goes on to hold that when she gives her account of the wrong of gaslighting, she writes that the gaslighter's characteristic desire is to destroy the possibility of disagreement, where the only sure path to that is destroying the source of the possible disagreement, the independent, separate, deliberative perspective from which disagreement might arise. And gaslighters for Abramson both characteristically believe that their targets are crazy and also behave in ways that aim to make them crazy, to destroy their independent perspective as a rational agent. Now, Abramson is sensitive to the criticism that this characterization of gaslighting might be held to be, quote, too sharp by half, end quote. And she's sensitive to the criticism, but in my view doesn't fully answer it satisfactorily. I'm going to be holding in effect that Abramson is really onto something about the gaslighter's aim, but that there are many roads to Rome here, and that there are much subtler and more everyday ways to try to squash someone's independent perspective other than by destroying their rationality entirely. I'm going to be arguing that Abramson's characterization of gaslighting is not broad enough to capture many of the phenomena that I'm about to go on to try to elucidate. Okay, so for me, gaslighting is a more everyday phenomenon, but that being said, I'm actually going to use quite stark and extreme examples of gaslighting initially, because what I think these examples do is allow us to distinguish the structure of gaslighting more easily, which we can then see actually applies to more everyday cases. So this is why I pick these quite stark examples for the purposes of initial elucidation, not because I think all gaslighting is like this, but because I think it makes the nature of gaslighting particularly clear. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at 3 types of examples of gaslighting in what follows. I'll look at the original case of gaslighting, which is how the term came into being. It's a somewhat complicated story, actually, so you'll have to indulge me as I go through the example and what the metaphor actually means, but we will get to that. Then I'm going to be distinguishing a phenomenon I've hinted at already, which I call moral gaslighting. And this is where someone uses the prospect of depicting someone as morally bad in order to manipulate her beliefs rather than the prospect of her being written off as irrational or insane or crazy in order to manipulate her beliefs. So this prospect of making someone out to be morally bad in some way is, I hold, a powerful technique of gaslighting, one that interacts with a lot of misogynistic social practices and mores. And to make that argument, I'm going to be using a real life case study, Dirty John, the podcast that was subsequently made into a hit TV series. And I'll also look at the sociological research that I mentioned from Paige Sweet, so sociological/psychological, where Sweet is interested in cases, among others, where someone is depicted as a crazy bitch with the emphasis on the latter gendered epithet. So those are some of the cases I'll consider, as well as the third type of example I'll be looking at are collective examples of gaslighting. So one such case is where we have a political agent, such as, say, the president of the United States, such as a Donald Trump, who gaslights, in particular, his supporters into buying wildly implausible narratives and political lines about what is going on that are manifestly false. I'll also look at the phenomenon of cultural gaslighting illuminated by the philosopher Elena Ruiz, where you have not even an agent involved, rather one collective group gaslighting another group. So for example, white folks gaslighting Indigenous and Black Americans in her example. And similarly, I'll look at the phenomenon of racial gaslighting, another collective phenomenon that is in some ways similar to the phenomenon of cultural gaslighting, but hints at some of the features that I will use in my subsequent definition of gaslighting that I hope to put forward. And this is very much a work in progress, but a working definition of gaslighting is what I will leave you with. Okay, so let's start with this original example of gaslighting. And yeah, I hope you'll not mind bearing with me as I go through the relevant details of the case. So the term gaslighting takes its name from the 1938 Patrick Hamilton play, Angel Street, which was performed on stage as Gaslight. The play was subsequently made into two films by the latter name, both a UK and an American version, which have become better known than the original play. But the play is, to my mind, richer than either film, and so it is going to form the basis for the discussion here. So in Gaslight, as I'll refer to it, Mr. Manningham appears to be intent on sending his wife Bella insane. His original motives for doing so only become apparent during the play's second act, but importantly, his behavior is intelligible right from the beginning, lending the play its claustrophobic, indeed suffocating atmosphere. Act 1 is a vivid depiction of domestic terror. Mr. Manningham wrongfoots and undermines his wife at every turn, humiliating her in front of their servant, correcting her constantly, and even impugning the anxiety he is thereby instilling in her as irrational and baseless. There's a little exchange at the beginning of Act 1 that brings this out, where Mr. Manningham asks, "Why are you so apprehensive, Bella? I was not about to reproach you." And she responds nervously, "No, dear, I know you weren't." But he goes on to reproach her, indeed berate her shortly thereafter. So we see that this is in a way gaslighting upon gaslighting. She's not even allowed to identify the ways in which her independent perspective is suppressed within their marriage. She's in a way obligated to make out that everything is fine between them interpersonally. So in a particularly cruel and long-running series of manipulations, Mr. Manningham has led his wife Bella to believe that she's going out of her mind and losing possession of her rational faculties by regularly hiding their possessions around their home and then holding her responsible for their disappearance. And he holds her responsible not merely causally, but also morally. He depicts her as mischievous and wicked, as well as confused and delusional. He also accuses her most painfully and, for my purposes, most interestingly of all, of deliberately hurting their pet dog, thus painting her as the cruel and abusive one, claiming that she just doesn't remember having done this cruel and malicious thing. And Bella really loves this dog, so it's a particularly painful accusation. Now, the combination of accusations is, of course, incoherent, as Bella Manningham tries repeatedly to point out to her husband. If she really is confused and delusional and cannot help her behavior, then surely he ought to treat her kindly and try to help her rather than getting angry. But Mr. Manningham ignores this, as he does with all of his wife's attempts to prevail upon his goodwill. She's truly powerless within their household. And she is a nobody outside of it, since her husband has deliberately isolated her from all of her friends and relatives. She has no choice but to defer to him, and even then it does little to appease his seething temper. So the effect of Mr. Manningham's behavior, which is a devastating portrait of a recognizable pattern of abuse, which subsequently came to be known as gaslighting for reasons I'll explain in a moment, the effect is to deprive Bella Manningham of the wherewithal to state even the most basic realities, despite her knowing them deep down to be the case. Toward the end of Act 1, in an arguably disappointing Deus Ex Machina, a detective comes to visit Bella and tells her the terrible, albeit liberating truth. Her husband is in fact the diabolical Sidney Power, who murdered the former resident of their house, Alice Barlow, in order to steal Barlow's rubies. And Power slit Alice Barlow's throat in order to silence her some 15 years prior, and then persuaded Bella to buy this house so that he could search for the rubies that he never located. In other words, he may never have managed to locate the rubies that motivated this murder, and Detective Ruff suspects this and confides in Bella. And he asks her, might he still in fact be looking for these jewels on the top floor of their home, this attic, which is shut up and off limits to Bella and even to the servants. And Bella realizes, or rather rediscovers the truth that she has in fact tacitly known all along, that this is, that he is brooding about up there at night. So this is how Mr. Manningham is exposed. And I'll just read this little exchange. So Bella Manningham says, "It all sounds so incredible, but when I'm alone at night, I get the idea that somebody's walking about up there. Up there at night when my husband's out, I hear noises from my bedroom, but I'm too afraid to go up." Detective Ruff asks, "Have you told your husband about this?" Bella says, "No, I'm afraid to. He gets angry. He says I imagine things which don't exist." Detective Ruff asks, "It never struck you, did it, that it might be your own husband walking about up there?" Bella Manningham said, "Yes, that is what I thought, but I thought I must be mad. Tell me how you know." Detective Ruff asks, "Why not tell me first how you knew, Mrs. Manningham?" "It's true then, it's true. I knew it, says Bella. So Bella Manningham did indeed know deep down that her husband was creeping about upstairs. For as she goes on to explain, 10 minutes after he left the house every evening, the gas light would ebb, and 10 minutes before he came back, it would return to its former full flame. That meant another light must have been turned on, then off again, somewhere in the house, because the glow of each light would diminish as another lamp siphoned gas pressure away from it. So Bella Manningham, despite knowing this, was forced to deny and could barely admit to herself what she knew. Her husband's epistemic domination over her was so total that she didn't dare to question his movements, let alone his motives. Indeed, she was the one who felt guilty for entertaining even the slightest doubts about her scurrilous lying husband. From the very beginning of the play, exchanges like the following one show how little latitude she has to question either the rightness of his beliefs or the benevolence of his actions. In Act 1, she ventures hopefully, Oh, Jack, dear, you've been so much kinder lately. Is it possible you're beginning to see my point of view? Mr. Manningham responds, I don't know that I ever differed from it, did I, Bella? Oh, Jack, dear, it's true, it's true. And here we get again those repetition of the words, it's true, it's true. But here, of course, they ring so hollow because much as Abramson's characterization of gaslighting has suggested, Mr. Manningham has quashed Bella's perspective, her point of view. She's not allowed to so much as acknowledge their divergence in points of view. It is gaslighting about the gaslighting in effect due to her lacking moral standing in the relationship. Okay, so here are some preliminary suggestive lessons that we can take from this case. Gaslighting can thus have a distinctively moral as well as rational dimension. Via a variety of techniques, of which more shortly, the victim may be effectively morally prohibited within the context of the relationship from disputing the gaslighter's epistemic authority, and with it his version of reality, his narrative, or his side of the story, which he gets to dictate and that overrides her own sense of that reality. She would be, in effect, committing a grievous sin again within the ethos of this relationship by questioning, challenging, or disagreeing with him regarding certain matters, which might be more or less extensive or alternatively domain specific. And this again recalls Abramson's characterization of gaslighting, where, to quote Abramson, what makes the difference between the fellow who merely ignores or dismisses evidence and the one who gaslights is the inability to tolerate even the possibility of challenge. But as I have noted, I think subtler techniques, rather than destroying someone's perspective outright, can be used to undermine someone's ability in practice to mount these kind of challenges to the gaslighter's perspective. And certainly one needn't literally drive her insane or even try to do this in order to gaslight. Okay, so I want to turn now to a real life case of gaslighting to start to make further points about the possibility of what I've called moral gaslighting. And another advantage of this case is that it's a real life one, it's not fictional, and it's scarcely less extreme than the foregoing fictional case. In some ways, it's more extreme. So on the hit podcast, Dirty John, Deborah Newell, a woman in her late 50s, falls in love with and marries a con artist named John. And again, I hope you won't mind indulging me as I lay out the details here. The details, as we'll see, do matter. So John pretended to be an anesthesiologist, dressing up in scrubs on their dates, while in reality, John was a nurse anesthetist who had been fired and suspended for stealing drugs intended for patients, some of whom were on the operating table at the time and thus would have been left in agony. He had a long history of addiction to prescription pain medication and had stalked and blackmailed many women. He had boasted of raping one of them, at least one of them. He had been repeatedly arrested, served with restraining orders, and when he met Deborah, unbeknownst to her, he had just gotten out of prison for felony drug theft. Just the most devious, dangerous, deceptive person was how one hardened career cop described John Meehan, hence his eponymous moniker, Dirty John. Some people also called him filthy. So far we haven't talked about gaslighting here. We've just talked about common or garden lying, which is a distinction I'll go on to make when I moot my definition of gaslighting. So Deborah's children had strong suspicions and worried about their mother. Eventually, Deborah found incontrovertible evidence of John's myriad deceptions. She found arrest warrants, restraining orders, jail and prison records, all of which was news to her, which revealed John's lies, and she moved out of their shared home in Newport Beach. Meanwhile, John was in hospital following a back surgery and ensuing complications of bowel obstruction. When Deborah withdrew from him, he began to threaten her and depicted her as the wrongdoer, accusing her of stealing from him, hitting him, and on no basis whatsoever. This was a go-to move for John, painting himself as a victim, again, on no basis whatsoever. And Deborah began to hide out from John in hotels on the advice of a detective whose help she had appealed to. So here's where the gaslighting comes in for the first time, given all of this backstory. Because somehow, nonetheless, in spite of all of this, Deborah not only forgave John, she was persuaded by him that it was all a big misunderstanding. She bought his demonstrable, dangerous lies, even after having discovered incontrovertible proof of his various fabrications. So here's LA Times journalist Christopher Goffard interviewing Deborah and shedding light on how he pulled off this feat. So Deborah testifies that 23 days go by while he's in hospital, and I just want to look him straight in the face and ask him why he did this, why all these lies, deceptions, and so on. So I went in there and he said those stories are wrong, that he was set up. He was trying to tell me so many times that he was set up and had to go to jail. Please forgive him. He just knew that I wouldn't understand until he had all the evidence in front of him. All a big misunderstanding? Asked Christopher, the journalist. All a big misunderstanding, and he had an answer for everything. And it was so convincing that I thought, okay, he literally had convinced me at this point that he is not this person. Despite all of the paperwork? Asked Christopher. Yes. And all the facts are right there in front of me, and he is that convincing that I would say that. She trails off. I was also in love with him. It's so hard when you're in love to listen. You're listening to your heart, not your head. So that's part of how he managed this. Christopher went on to ask, did you ask him about his nickname, Dirty John? Deborah, he said it wasn't true. He said, I don't know where you got that from. It was as if everything, she trails off again. He was able to convince me. He was so good at it. It could be a cold day out and he could convince me it's 95 degrees. That's how good he was, to where you questioned yourself. It's almost like he convinced you that all the facts about his life were some kind of hallucination on your part. Yes, he made me out to be the one. That's kind of a crucial giveaway line, that he was this great guy and that everyone else had done him wrong is what he said. He always had a story. He told me that he had lied because he thought he'd lose me, that he feels so lucky that I'm such a forgiving person who, hell, I'm the love of his life, that I've made him a better person. Just all this kind of stuff. I felt guilty to some degree that I'd married him and that he's in the hospital, but at the same time I feared. Explain that to me, says Christopher. Guilty, why? And the response was from Deborah, because I made a commitment. I made a commitment to marriage, for better, for worse. So what emerges in this case, which was commonly called gaslighting in the media, social media, many articles, was notice that John has here, in effect, a moral carrot and a moral stick, which allows him to manipulate Deborah's beliefs. The moral carrot is something like this. If you believe my story, no matter how demonstrably false it is, I will hold you up to be this wonderful paragon of virtue, a wonderful wife, a loving partner, an incredibly forgiving and sympathetic person who deserves to be valorized, lionized, and who is put on a pedestal. However, if you don't buy my fabrications, I will hold you up to be cruelly unforgiving and shamefully disloyal, etc. So these are moral ways of manipulating someone into buying the kind of narrative that John wants her to buy, even if perhaps deep down she never ultimately believes it whole cloth. She nonetheless bought his line, his narrative regarding his life for a long time. So notice that importantly, John never alleged that Deborah was crazy. He made her out to be a bad person when she challenged or withdrew for him, and a good person for believing him. His epistemic bait for swallowing his story was moral and effective, effective with an A, as well as luck would have it, an E. It was the prospect of being depicted as bad or mean, not mad or stupid, that made Deborah unable to continue to think ill of John. And that is what allowed him to gaslight her so effectively. Okay, so I want to suggest now that these moral techniques of gaslighting are actually rather common, drawing on this sociological/psychological research by Paige Sweet. So Paige Sweet has done one of the few pieces of extensive qualitative research on the nature of gaslighting, which is therefore very useful for my purposes. There's not a whole lot of studies of this kind, and this is a fairly recent 2019 study. Hopefully more empirical work along these lines will be done by Sweet and others. So what Paige Sweet found was that crazy bitch was the classic refrain, the literal discourse of the gaslighter in her study, which she conducted with 43 female DV survivors who she recruited through domestic violence shelters. All but one of them had male abusers. And interestingly, Sweet was originally trying to contrast abuse survivors who had, or victims who had been gaslit from those who hadn't. But she actually found that all 43 of the participants in her qualitative study had been gaslit. So that's interesting in itself. And what I want to point out is that if we focus on the second epithet, the bitch epithet, we can see that there is this moral dimension to gaslighting very commonly, where people are depicted as bad or shameful in a variety of ways in order to gaslight them. So here are some examples from Sweet's study. So these are all pseudonyms, fairly obviously, for obvious reasons. So Simone was accused of adultery and not being a good enough mother. Nevaeh was also accused of being a bad mother. Carla was accused of being a prostitute, where it was clear in context that was a pejorative term or referent, and that she too would make a bad mother while she was pregnant. Rosa, Mariposa, and Adriana were accused of cheating on their partners. Jaylene was called a hoe and a slut by her boyfriend. Fabiola was called nasty and sick by her partner after sex, leading to her sense she was bad. Margaret was accused of deliberately attracting too much sexual attention. Maria S. was told she was too sexually forward by her husband after he propositioned her. Ruby was said to be a witch, and it was said that she was trapping her husband in the marriage, where in fact the reverse was true. He was trying to keep her in the marriage. And Rosalind and Louisa were portrayed by their abusers as the real aggressor or abuser, which in the case of Rosalind led to Rosalind being arrested, despite the fact that she was the victim and target of abuse in this case, which is sadly not uncommon. So what's really interesting to me about these cases is that even though Sweet's official definition of gaslighting didn't necessarily lead her to look for moral instances of gaslighting, she nonetheless uncovered them in the course of looking at ways in which women's sexuality was weaponized against them in order to gaslight them. And I should make it clear that in the examples I've just given, we haven't yet established that these instances count as gaslighting according to what will eventually be my definition. I'm taking Sweet's research expert testimony here as granted that this was gaslighting in these instances, and thus that these are moral dimensions or examples of gaslighting, given that there were independent reasons to think that gaslighting was going on in these cases. So that is some empirical evidence that gaslighting commonly resorts to moral images of people in order to do the work of gaslighting them, to make them, roughly speaking, believe or at least buy a narrative that is demonstrably false in line with the gaslighter's desires and interests. That's a rough characterization, but I'll refine it before too long. So here are some more lessons that I'll just go through briefly before I move on to collective gaslighting. The upshot is that making someone question their own rationality or think they're positively crazy is only one way to achieve the kind of epistemic domination which gaslighting characteristically aims at. Sometimes the gaslighter may manage to make his victim feel morally compromised and, for example, bad, shameful, depraved, guilty, disloyal, or insufficiently sympathetic, in as much as she deviates from his preferred narrative. And this is in a way not so surprising. So one way of glossing the lesson of Miranda Fricker's framework of testimonial injustice is to say that there are moral as well as rational reasons to believe some people's stories. So, for example, it would be immoral as well as irrational to discount the word of a woman due to sexist stereotypes. And what gaslighting can take advantage of is both the rational reasons for believing someone and the moral reasons. So imagine, for example, if John had said, in fact, here truly, look, there's this terrible stereotype about convicted felons. I'm a convicted felon. Believe my story, because otherwise you'd be doing me an epistemic injustice. Now, that's, of course, a more sophisticated line than he wielded against Deborah, but the overall effect would be the same. He would be invoking a moral reason for belief in order to prevail upon her to buy his story, where that is weaponizing a moral reason for belief, where in fact none actually applies, because he was a liar and fabricating these both facts about his life and stories about his good character. So plying someone into epistemic submission in these ways by appealing to her moral capacities can have much the same effect as making her doubt her rational capacities. But importantly, it's plausibly much easier to achieve. Now, why is that? Well, very crudely, speaking just for myself, and you might want to reflect on whether this is true for you too, I don't characteristically doubt my basic sanity or rationality. Basic sanity is a relatively low bar. It would be pretty difficult for an agent to make me think I have the wrong beliefs because I'm just out of touch with basic realities about my environment. However, like most people who care about morality and doing the right thing and ethics and all that good stuff, I could much more easily be made to feel that I'm insufficiently sympathetic, insufficiently loyal, and am morally in the wrong more broadly for not believing someone's story. So making someone believe that they are bad, shameful, depraved, guilty, disloyal, and insufficiently sympathetic, for those of us who are worried about these kinds of vices and are worried about these kinds of moral mistakes, it's relatively easy to appeal to someone's moral capacities in this way and thus manipulate her beliefs, given that these sorts of moral mistakes happen to everyone, since epistemic justice is hard to achieve as an individual. It's hard not to err when it comes to moral reasons for belief. We make mistakes in either direction pretty commonly. Okay, so that I think helps show that the moral technique of gaslighting is of more than academic interest. It shows how gaslighting can be a broader and more prevalent phenomenon than we might have hitherto suspected, and an easier thing to pull off. Okay, I don't want to, I think we've gotten the basic gist of this, but the basic idea here is that the intended result is that if someone questions or opposes the gaslighter, then that will only strengthen the pre-existing case against her that there's something fundamentally wrong with her, either rationally, for example, she's delusional, crazy, paranoid, etc., or morally, she's a heartless bitch, nasty woman, incapable of trust, cruelly unforgiving, and so on. And so the end result being much the same as well. We'll have someone who is unable or unwilling to challenge him. So gaslighting thus results in a typical interpersonal case of someone who is under a false sense of moral and or rational obligation to espouse his story over her own. Okay, so just briefly a few collective examples of this phenomenon, and then I'll move to my definition of gaslighting. So gaslighting has also been identified as a political phenomenon in cases like the gaslighting of Trump vis-a-vis his supporters in particular. So in Gaslit Nation, a podcast by Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Chalupa, they hold that Trump was gaslighting America. Similarly, a book by Amanda Carpenter and the article that went viral, Donald Trump is Gaslighting America by Lauren Duca. And I should say that what these various articles, books, and the podcast seem to be picking up on is that Trump's lies and propaganda was far more systematic than is the case even for the average, none too honest, let's say, politician. So there was something particularly systematic and long range about his gaslighting efforts, and they came via a variety of channels and media. A related example that I owe to Elena Ruiz is that of cultural gaslighting, where there are a lot of moving parts to her definition, but she holds that the basic idea is simple enough. She holds that the social and historical infrastructural support mechanisms that disproportionately produce abusive mental ambience in settler colonial cultures in order to further the ends of cultural genocide and dispossession. That's what cultural gaslighting is. For example, the systemic patterns of mental abuse against women of color and Indigenous women in North America that distribute, reproduce, and automate social inequalities in favor of white settler populations. And finally, a similar definition of racial gaslighting by the political scientists Angelique Davis and Rose Ernst. They define racial gaslighting as the political, social, economic, and cultural process that perpetuates and normalizes a white supremacist reality through pathologizing those who resist. And to cut a long story short, I think that these collective examples of gaslighting should be taken seriously and accommodated in the eventual definition of gaslighting that we come up with. So it won't surprise you that that's what I'm going to try to do in what follows. Okay. And another thing I should add about this definition is that it's an attempt to distinguish gaslighting from mere denial, disagreement, and manipulation. So it's an attempt to give a more substantive characterization of gaslighting that gets at what gaslighting is distinctively and doesn't count mere disagreement, denial, or manipulation as a case in point. That would be far too broad a definition. Okay. So here is my proposed working definition of gaslighting. You're very curious to hear what you all have to say about this. But here it is. I hold that gaslighting is a systematic process which functions to make the target, interlocutor, or audience illicitly feel defective, either morally or rationally, for epistemic deviance, that is, from departing for a prescribed narrative and or adhering to a proscribed narrative for her/them. And in the last couple of minutes here that I have, I'm just going to try to bring out a few features of this definition, and we can obviously talk more about its intended features and perhaps bugs in the Q&A. So here are some points to note about this definition. I want to be clear here that this makes gaslighting not a success term. You can gaslight someone without that having the effect of making her illicitly feel defective. This is not meant to be something that has to quote unquote succeed in order to count as an instance of that kind. Importantly here, illicitly is meant to rule out cases where the target in fact ought to be convinced by an epistemic authority figure of the defectiveness of some epistemic stance of hers, and possibly her own defectiveness for buying some kind of false or unjustified narrative. So there are lots of questions to be asked about what this illicitly amounts to exactly, but for my purposes, I want to leave it fairly open to interpretation by different first-order normative theorists, because the question of when exactly it is licit versus illicit to try to persuade someone of the defectiveness of some narrative that they have bought into and invested in, I think that is very much up for grabs. So that's in a way a problem for everyone within first order normative ethics. But this is not just an empty part of the definition. It says that, for example, an attempt to persuade someone that she is being paranoid, where that is in fact accurate, that she is being paranoid, that wouldn't count as gaslighting according to this definition. This definition is meant to accommodate not only unintentional interpersonal, but also purely structural cases. So when it comes to the collective examples of gaslighting that I gave earlier, it's meant to be able to accommodate those because it doesn't require an agent and it doesn't require a particular individual victim. It can be a process that works via a culture or a collective on a broader audience. And it also, I hold, can accommodate subtler interpersonal cases of a non-Machiavellian kind. And I'll just give one very quick example of this sort. So imagine that an agent has a history of drug abuse and is deeply ashamed of that and is trying to hide it from his partner, for example. And so whenever and suppose too that he has relapsed and is now using drugs again after allegedly and ostensibly becoming sober. So his shame might lead to him saying things to his partner like, don't you trust me? And you're undermining my progress. And of course I'm not, succumbing to my addiction. Things like that would count on this definition as gaslighting, even though the intent isn't to manipulate someone and it's not a Machiavellian case. It's a case where someone's shame and secrecy causes them to gaslight, not out of an original intent to manipulate, but rather out of a desire to not be perceived as having relapsed. So that's an example of this non-Machiavellian kind. A couple of other points just to finish up. This is compatible with the intriguing and important possibility of self-gaslighting that I think is important to consider and that I'd welcome questions on. And another point to note is that I hold that gaslighting needn't aim contra Abramson to change minds as opposed to mouths. So some gaslighters will not, in fact, really care if the victim or target of gaslighting deep down believes the implausible line being promulgated. What they care about is that the victim or target of gaslighting will maintain, if you like, the party line, the official prescribed narrative, or will give up the proscribed forbidden narrative that they would otherwise espouse. And similarly, the gaslighter needn't be convinced of the defectiveness of the target, nor the correctness of their preferred narrative. A final point to note here before I finish up is that this theorizes the victims of a quote unquote successful gaslighting, that is one that goes through, to use this philosopher's term of art of success here, it theorizes the victims of a gaslighting attempt that works as having at least a compromised independent perspective rather than one that is necessarily destroyed outright. And this is important because what I think the mistake that Abramson makes is thinking that the gaslighter needs and insists upon a guarantee that the victim or target can't challenge his perspective. I think he can just as easily rely in some instances on, if you like, a rigged game, where this has the appearance of a disagreement, but in fact, the decks are heavily stacked against her, the target of gaslighting, winning the argument. He has, in effect, quashed her ability to challenge him in a robust way by making her illicitly feel defective for so doing. And this helps to explain a point that we can talk more about in the Q&A, the way that disagreement, far from necessarily constituting gaslighting, may in fact be its natural antidote. So I'll finish there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. And we we will have a lot to talk about in the time we have left. We're going to go probably until about another 25 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes, something like that. So we have an audience right now in the hundreds, and let me invite our audience to submit questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom. As we always do, and maybe some of you are joining us for the first time, but this became our practice last year when we did many of these programs. I will try to get to as many of the questions as I can. Sometimes I will synthesize them or put two questions together into one, but we do our best to convey as many questions as possible to our speaker. And after such a rich talk, it will be impossible to get to all of them, but we will certainly try. Let me start with a question like this. I'm glad you began the exposition in the middle of the talk by talking about the Hamilton play, because I think like a lot of people, my first encounter with the term gaslighting, with the origin of the term gaslighting, was the film from, I think, 1944, the US film directed by George Cukor with Charles Boyer and Ingrid Bergman. And only later did I encounter the play by Hamilton, which I think you're quite right to say is more complex than the American film version. And I've never seen the British film version, so I can't say anything about that. But if you go back to that originary example that you and everyone points to as the origin of the term, it seems built into the notion of gaslighting that it involves at a minimum of a male-female dynamic. One might even go on to say perhaps a partner to partner, or not, that's too anachronistic a term to talk about the 1940s, a husband to wife dynamic, right? For that play and that film. How would it be right to imagine that kind of dynamic is built into the term? Why is it so common in gaslighting? And are there other kinds of socio-political dynamics that also count as gaslighting?
Yeah, thank you so much for that great question. Look, I think that, so in some ways, the male-female dynamics I've highlighted here are an artifact of how I came to this topic, which is being interested in how powerful a tool gaslighting is for perpetuating misogyny. That being said, I actually don't think that gaslighting should be seen as necessarily a gendered phenomenon. I think it is contingently and as a matter of fact, often a gendered phenomenon. So for example, that I think makes sense to the fact that some of our best, starkest examples of this are it occurring in husband-wife relationships. And one reason that is that there is a sense of epistemic entitlement that permeates those relationships, where a man in particular feels entitled to uphold and have dominate his particular preferred version of reality, no matter how implausible. But that being said, I think that this dynamic, even though it is exposed so clearly by these cases, it can happen in other socio-political dynamics too. Really, any case where someone is vulnerable to epistemic domination is a possible recipe for gaslighting, given other factors. So for example, the gaslighting of Black and brown folks by whites is something that Elena Ruiz rightly points to, which I think is an important and deeply troubling dynamic. Similarly, on a more, and yes, I'm just adding the reference slide so people can access that important piece on cultural gaslighting. So another context in which gaslighting can occur is within families. So parents have a kind of power over children in virtue of their both epistemic and moral position, and can do it to children quite commonly. And often this isn't with bad motives. So there was another example of gaslighting that, if it had been a longer talk, I might have gotten into, of a podcast, Heavyweight, where a man, Rob, thinks he broke his arm actually, as a young child. And he asked his parents and his sister and his brother, oh, how exactly did this happen? Because his daughter had broken her arm in a similar way. And so he's just curious. And they all say, oh, that never happened. His brother said, no, I'm the broken arm guy. His sister says, I'm the keeper of family memories. If anyone remembered this, I would. His mother says, I'm a nurse. If you had broken your arm, I would have remembered. And his father said, oh yeah, Rob again, looking for sympathy. So they both morally and epistemically shame him for this memory that after 45 minutes of podcast turns out to be completely accurate. There are hospital records from the time showing he broke his arm in exactly the way that he remembers. And the family didn't intend to gaslight him. They're not a particularly bad or unusual family. They just have their narratives that turn out to be able to epistemically dominate actual reality. So yeah, I think in these cases where there is an underlying vulnerability because of things like race, class, being trans versus cis, being queer versus straight, and just in the fact that you're a child who's still somewhat subject to family and parental narratives, there is that risk of epistemic domination that gaslighting constitutes.
So to pivot from that question to something closely related. When in the definition that you arrive at, which I scribbled down from the slide,
and I could get back to it.
Put it up if you want to. I'll paraphrase it, but catch me if I miss a nuance. What I like about the definition is that there are I would say the definitional weight in it is distributed evenly across several different key pieces. So it is a systematic process. It's not one-off. It is to make someone, the target, illicitly feel defective. And then there's a qualification, morally or rationally. So that's the affective part of it is really quite important. Illicitly feel defective, right? It's if you don't have that piece, much of the rest of the definition could sound like a description of the way that academics talk to each other in Q&A, right? I mean, in my discipline, which is literature, we tend to be fairly polite with each other, but in your discipline, I've seen philosophers be quite determined to criticize people who are departing from a prescribed narrative or what, you know what I mean?
Indeed.
So, but the systematic piece, the affective piece, and then for epistemic deviance, and then you get into the part that I'm also interested in about narrative, that there's a narrative behind this. And I assume you're using that term quite consciously, that this, it's not necessarily a single idea. It's not necessarily a kind of loose notion out there by itself, but that what is being departed from or what is being proscribed to the target is something that can be narrated, something that can be told, to take it really strictly, something that in a way has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I'd love to hear your comments on the kind of distribution of definitional weight that I'm trying to point out here and how you arrived at it.
Yeah, I love that question because as you can see, and as I hopefully came out during the talk, this really is a work in progress definition. I've been thinking about gaslighting for a long time, but getting the definition just right is really tricky. For example, should it be feel and seem defective rather than just feel defective? I tend to think not, because take an example like the Dixie Chicks, now the Chicks, being depicted as crazy for their opposition to the Iraq War. I think that's very close to gaslighting. And in fact, their subsequent album, I forget the exact title, but it referred to gaslighting. But I don't think they were quite gaslit because they weren't necessarily made to feel crazy, although it's possible that happened independently or as a result of similar processes, but rather they were written off in society as crazy by a certain sector. And so as always, I kind of remain open to broadening the definition in various ways, but I think the seam would be a wrongful inclusion, I'm tempted to think. So to circle back to the other parts of the definition that you rightly highlighted, I've now just mentioned a piece that nearly went in there, but I ended up omitting for those intuitive reasons. So the systematicity of it really matters because it isn't a one-off thing. And a real danger in writing about gaslighting as a philosopher is that you get these brief examples of gaslighting, which are really just disagreement or denial, where one person says P, whatever proposition that might be, and another person says, no, that's wrong. And in point of fact, I actually think that that ability to robustly disagree with each other is a practice that is the antidote to gaslighting practices, in as much as it admits a healthy divergence of perspectives and admits that reasonable minds can disagree and have different takes on even quite simple realities as well as more complex ones. So that's where the systematicity matters. This is an ongoing process of undermining. It's not just one person saying to another individual, for the purposes of a kind of toy example in a philosophy paper. No, it involves more atmosphere, more build-up, and usually it's a long-term project when it happens interpersonally or politically. So that's one aspect that I really wanted to highlight here. I think I went through some of the ways that it's important that that process be identified as an illicit one to keep the term gaslighting as a pejorative term. Because, look, I don't want to be an apologist for my discipline. We have lots of problems. And philosophers can be super aggressive to each other in ways that can, I think, constitute gaslighting. However, it's not just the disagreement aspect of it that makes for gaslighting there, it's the epistemic domination. And to defend philosophy a little bit in theory, at least, if not in practice, one thing I love about philosophy is that it is, I think, of any humanities discipline, perhaps the most in love with disagreement.
Yes.
And it can be a bad thing in as much as then epistemically dominant people disagree in, implausible or overly vehement ways with more junior and vulnerable people. But it can also be a wonderful thing in as much as more vulnerable and junior people get to say no to putative authority figures, both historical and contemporary. So at its best, philosophy, I think, can work as an antidote to gaslighting by saying, yeah, everyone is entitled to a well-reasoned, well thought out, well-defended, well-argued position, even if it's unorthodox. So that's part of what I had in mind when I was coming up with this definition, that in what ways do philosophers gaslight each other? And in what ways do we, in fact, help each other avoid gaslighting and practice something that is better morally and epistemically? Yeah. And the last piece of the puzzle is, I actually, just to kind of peel back the curtain, such as it is, I actually originally talked about narrative deviance rather than epistemic deviance, because the word epistemic isn't ideal here, because I'm not just interested in official beliefs that are changed by gaslighting or that are manipulated. I'm interested in what stories we buy, where sometimes the agent who's gaslit in the back of their minds knows or has at least warranted beliefs that are contrary to the gaslighter, but they nonetheless mouth and parrot and mimic the gaslighter's preferred narrative. And I also don't want to rule out the possibility maybe gaslighting technically could pertain to a single belief or proposition. I think that almost never happens. It almost always is about an overarching story, which, as you said, has a beginning, middle, and an end, and often a certain upshot or import. Yeah. So that's why I have an EG in front of the narrative parts of the definition. So I think that's the most common case. But I do want to allow that epistemic deviance more broadly is what is policed and enforced by gaslighting, even though the most common case has to do with which narratives are bought into, sold, and bought.
I treasure that answer because of the way you gave us the reflection on how the definition was made. And I'm sure I'm not the only one watching who feels grateful to have heard that from you. Here's a question from the audience. Could you speak a bit more about the relevance for your definition of intention versus impact on the part of the gaslighter? How much self-reflexivity, perhaps not the same as intention, does your definition need to assume on the gaslighter's part? And relatedly then, could you talk a bit more about when or how it matters if the parties are individuals or systems interacting with each other?
Yeah, excellent question. I really appreciate that. So I want to allow that there need be no intentional component to this, even when it is an individual agent who is doing the gaslighting. This is also important to allow for the possibility of collective gaslighting, because with certain fairly limited exceptions, I generally don't think of collectives as having intentions, although that's, of course, I mean, it's a terribly interesting and well theorized philosophical topic, but that's in a way because collectives having intentions is, I think it's fair to say, the exception to the rule. Usually collective structures don't carry with them intentions, at least not in this pointed sense in which we might think of gaslighting. So as an example of unintentional interpersonal gaslighting, well, first, let's just be careful, because almost no one has the explicit intention of gaslighting someone else as such, or de dicto. What people have is the intention of gaslighting someone de re, meaning they intend to do the thing that qualifies as gaslighting, meaning making someone feel bad for their beliefs, roughly speaking. And that can be an intention that the relatively Machiavellian agents have, like the Mr. Manninghams and Dirty Johns. They are intent on bringing about a different epistemic state in their victim for the sake, seemingly in both cases, of epistemic domination. The cruelty is the point, to borrow a phrase from Adam Serwer. I can't pronounce it, but his excellent book came out recently with that title. But that's very different from the unintentional case that I mentioned ever so briefly, the shame or secrecy-based kind of gaslighting that isn't intentional whatsoever, and where there's no intention to do anything really other than escape the anxiety, shame, and ignominy of having one's relapse from this addiction, this illness, revealed within the context of a relationship. So I like thinking about this kind of case as a very everyday sort of case, the sort of thing that could happen to anyone in a way. Think of something you feel deeply ashamed of, and think of how you might try to get someone not to tell the story of what is happening or what you've done, even though there's excellent evidence that this is in fact happening. And so I think that can, one thing I worry about when I give this talk is I want us to think of ourselves all as not just potential victims or targets of gaslighting, but also as potential gaslighters. Because it turns out that it's actually, especially within the context of families, easier to do this inadvertently than one might have supposed initially, even with the best of intentions. For example, because you're a parent who has to promulgate a narrative that your children are happy. And so you won't hear their evidence or testimony that they're actually unhappy in a particular situation. You won't actually hear the emotional testimony they give because it's too upsetting or anxiety inducing or confronting. So yeah, that's another of these inadvertent cases where well-intentioned people who are not at all Mr. Manningham or Dirty John type characters can unintentionally purvey gaslighting as understood via this definition.
Thank you so much for that. Here's a question that I really like because it's nobody else has asked anything quite like this. I wonder if the undermining of somebody's grasp on their own sense of humor also counts as a kind of gaslighting. Perhaps that would stretch the notion too far, but it seems to me, I'm quoting the questioner, that accusations of being a humorless bitch often have a similar shape to the moral cases described, and at least the stakes for being, so to speak, fit for sociability are similar. Perhaps it is simply another tool in the gaslighter's toolbox, but it might be worth thinking about in its relation to the moral.
Oh, that is such a good example. I hadn't thought of that. I love, thank you so much for the richness of that observation, because I absolutely think calling someone a humorless bitch could do the same kind of thing functionally as I pointed out here. And in a way, it's an aesthetic criticism rather than, I mean, it's partly moral or moralized. And I'll get to that in a moment. Here's why I think it probably comes under the purview of a moral criticism for the purposes of this definition, but it's nonetheless a really good example that I hadn't thought of. So one other thing that I've thought hard about with this definition is moral and rational sufficient here, or could there be further reasons for belief that can be weaponized against victims or targets of gaslighting? For example, are there aesthetic ways we could gaslight someone? So for example, calling someone ugly is often a way to disrupt her sense of self, kind of quite similar to this case, and make her back off certain perhaps confronting or inconvenient truths that she is espousing. So I think in the end, that's an indirect way of gaslighting. And in the end, it's not that someone is being told that they're, that there's an aesthetic reason for belief that they'll somehow be more attractive if they espouse the line that the gaslighter prefers, or stop espousing the forbidden narrative that they're currently espousing. I think it's rather that these are ways to try to, I tend to think that they're either mere insults directed at someone for having certain beliefs rather than targeting specific ways in which you want them to have new beliefs or give up old ones. Or what it does, I think, in other cases is hold that someone is in fact morally defective in some way. There's an implication that there's something morally wrong with them because they're aesthetically displeasing. So there's a kind of indirect route into the moral case. And I think the easiest way to see this is there's no direct aesthetic reason to have certain beliefs, I take it. Even reasons to believe that have the scientific form of simplicity and beauty of a scientific explanation are in the end rational reasons to believe, and others that have an aesthetic form turn out to have this, in the end, moral implications. Mm-hmm. So I think that the moral and rational reasons to believe are exhaustive, and that's of course a controversial claim, and that makes me reluctant to think of purely aesthetic cases of gaslighting. However, aesthetic moralized insults like humorless bitch, or like calling someone an ugly bitch, these moralized aesthetic criticisms can have gaslighting effects. Mm-hmm. So that's how I'm inclined to think, but it's also something I want to think more about.
Thank you. And I think that to shift from the aesthetic now to something social, here's a question I'm quoting. Hello and welcome to the Humanities Center from a new fellow. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about gaslighting during the pandemic, as manifested in the characterization of concerns about health risks, especially in work environments, as anxiety. For example, The Guardian ran an article this summer entitled "Therapists Report Huge Rise in Cases of Anxiety as England Ends COVID Rules." While the pandemic has indeed led to depression and anxiety, the case study the article cites features a woman working in a convenience store simply asking for more workplace protections. So I think the gist of this question is how has the pandemic led to gaslighting, exposed gaslighting, and involved it in various ways?
Yeah, I love that example. I mean, there are a number of ways in which we've seen gaslighting as a kind of practice that is a concern during the pandemic. And one of them is that we pathologize legitimate concerns about, say, workplace safety become, look, I mean, I'm a fan of therapy, lots of people can benefit from it, but it's in effect reduced to an individual concern that demands therapeutic amelioration rather than material changes to make your environment safer. The person in question might be anxious, but the anxiety isn't the first cause here. They're anxious because their material environment ought to be safer. So there's a real danger of gaslighting someone into thinking they have this individual psychological pathology rather than a legitimate concern that can result in stress and other psychological symptoms. So that will absolutely count as gaslighting on this way of thinking about things. Something that I've also been interested in, and this is really just to raise a question of my own, are the differences between gaslighting and conspiracy theories that people have a responsibility for buying into. So I don't want this definition of gaslighting to mean that someone who buys into, say, QAnon is the victim of gaslighting, because I think they have a lot of epistemic agency in what they choose to believe with regard to what's wildly implausible. So one thing that I've worried about this way of thinking about gaslighting is, does it or should it create a bright line between cases where someone is the victim of this term that is pejorative, they're the victim of gaslighting, versus cases in which they're really participating in their own epistemic oppression. They're really complicit in, say, buying anti-vax faux theories and buying demonstrable falsehoods under the guise of doing their own research rather than deferring to people with the appropriate scientific expertise. So this is a very subtle question that intersects with lots of topics about the nature of misinformation and echo chambers and indeed cults. So I don't at all pretend to have the right take on this overall, but I do think it would be good to think more clearly than I've been able to so far about, well, what is the difference between gaslighting and epistemic complicity in being dominated by misinformation that the agent had a responsibility to avoid, criticize, and not to take seriously. And we've certainly seen a lot of that in the pandemic. I don't think anti-vaxxers are the victims of gaslighting, in other words.
I see. Okay. I think I have to express my regret to our audience because we have so many questions, and so many of them are so trenchant that I wish we had another hour for this, but I'm not going to be able to get to most of them. So let me finish as we head toward the end. Let me finish with Kate, a methodological question. I'm going to choose to ask this near the end because you were so open about reflecting on your own the construction of your definition. And this is kind of a question in the same spirit. And I would formulate it like this. Philosophers often work with a specialized vocabulary. But this is a case which we see sometimes in which a philosopher is plucking a term from common discourse and lending it rigor. That is, it's a term that you are, in a sense, redefining on the fly as we are continuing to use it in daily life, and trying to insert a framework into it and give us that framework to work with from this point on. And it's clear from the Q&A that a lot of the questioners feel that you've encouraged them to rethink a term that they use a lot, and that and that in some cases now to see it as applicable in their own lives, because as soon as they hear a rigorous definition of it, as opposed to the way it may often be used, say, in journalism or in popular culture, you've brought them to a different understanding of it. From your point of view, though, as a philosopher, could you say a little bit about the challenges of, in a sense, rehabilitating a term like that already comes to you with a history, with a long history, and with that's already being used everywhere in the culture? And relatedly, how do you confront, as someone working in this particular question, how do you confront the danger of the term becoming too big?
Yeah, I love that question because I worry about this a lot. I've worried about this in defining misogyny and similarly defining gaslighting here. So I would distinguish a couple of different possibilities, and this is drawing on work by Sally Hasslinger, who was my advisor as a PhD student at MIT, a wonderful feminist philosopher who's really paved the way for this kind of theorizing. So one thing we can do as philosophers or as humanists and theorists more broadly is try to give a conceptual analysis of some term. And that's kind of really old school stuff that is often very illuminating, but it's really trying to say, well, if the dictionary were much more sophisticated, well, actually, that's complicated. I should just say, given the concept as it stands, how should we analyze that? And given a certain conception of what a dictionary does, it would be like a premium dictionary definition. Here's another, and I'm not so interested in that kind of project because often terms have weird histories and come into and out of broader usages. And if you look at Google Ngram charts, they skyrocket and then they dip. For example, critical race theory skyrocketed in common parlance and is now dipping again. And I say this as someone who teaches critical race theory and loves that tradition and is interested in ways in which that term has been weaponized against theorists in the tradition. So I'm not doing conceptual analysis. So here are two other possibilities for what I might be doing. And I actually think I'm doing something different in the case of gaslighting versus misogyny. So one thing you might do is say, here's a term, and here are the properties that it refers to using, for example, paradigm cases. So that's what I've tried to do when it comes to gaslighting. Point to paradigm cases, both ones perhaps used to coin the term, ones that saw people reaching for the term, like Dirty John, and also maybe more, I don't want to say marginal cases, but ones that are more controversial, like these instances of collective gaslighting, where some of the philosophers I began with actually explicitly deny the possibility of collective gaslighting. But I think we should take them seriously. And so the attempt is there to kind of ask, what is the term getting at that underlies all of these instances, if anything? And relatedly, and this is where it shades into the third kind of project, what is the most useful way of thinking about this term, given what we want to do politically? So politically, the aim, among others, is to empower people who would otherwise be the targets or victims of something bad in the vicinity of gaslighting. Then there's a third thing you can do, which is to go for a really revisionary definition, which is more stipulative and says, look, here's perhaps a conflict in how the term is used or the properties which we are pointing at using the term. And I'm going to take a political as well as epistemic stand on what use of the term would be politically most fruitful. For example, if we're faced with a choice between a feminist understanding of misogyny as something broad and systemic and socio-political versus a psychologistic definition of it as an individual property of bad apples, then I hold, given that conflict, I want to stipulate a much more useful definition of misogyny is along the former lines that captures a strand in feminist usage. That gets at a systematic phenomenon of a social environment that women face rather than a mean feeling men feel. And so that is what Sally Hasslinger refers to as an ameliorative project, as opposed to the earlier project that I mentioned, which is descriptive. And so here I'm sort of really thinking in descriptive terms about what gaslighting is, thinking what's the property in the vicinity of the referent of the term. But sometimes I think we can be quite explicitly revisionary and say, I'm going to home in on a strand of ordinary usage that I think is superior to other strands and brings out something that we ought to be able to talk about using a morally weighty term. And then the hope is, and this is always up for grabs in public discourse, do people take it up and run with it?
Yeah.
And that is, that's where it comes down to a matter of philosophical luck.
Yeah. Oh, but that's an eloquent account of what you're trying to do. I appreciate that, and also hopeful in a way. We hope that things catch on semantically in the way that you're talking about. Yeah. We have to conclude, but I want to thank you again and invite the audience to join me in thanking Professor Kate Manne and all of you, in fact, for joining us today in this virtual format. As we conclude now, I want to give a shout out to the staff of the Stanford Humanities Center who work behind the scenes to make these events happen. We are planning to make the transition gradually back to in-person events as conditions allow. But even then, to make those events available online for those of you who are not able to join us in the building behind me. It's not simply that it's been rewarding to be able to share our events with the world during the pandemic, it's that it has gradually occurred to us that we are changing the nature of this kind of institution, and we thank you for your support. Everyone who registered for today's event was automatically entered into a drawing to receive one of 3 copies of Professor Manne's book, Entitled, including a book plate signed by her. And so I would like to announce today's winners. They are Ella Lark, Christopher McBride, and Joyce Porter. Congratulations, thank you for attending, and we'll be in touch by email about getting the book to each of you. As I mentioned at the outset, we're looking forward to a lively year at the center, and we hope all of you will want to join us for events, either in person when that's possible or live on Zoom. And in particular, please mark your calendar for October 19th, when the historian Timothy Snyder of Yale University will deliver the year's first presidential lecture in the humanities online. His topic is the 5 forms of freedom. More events are being added to the calendar, so as always, check out our website, shc.stanford.edu, for the latest updates. So long for now from the Stanford Humanities Center.